Every time a truck moves, a plane takes off, or a factory powers up in America, there's something happening behind the scenes, an agreement nobody voted for. Canada puts a 250% tariff on dairy, the US responds with 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. The rhetoric gets loud, but beneath it all, 4.3 million barrels of Canadian oil keep flowing into the US daily. No headlines. No cameras. Just the silent, invisible bloodstream of the North American economy. But in early 2025, everything changed with a single line. Not shouted. Not televised. Just leaked. A plan to hit Canadian energy products with a 10% tariff. The move was sudden, and in Ottawa, it landed hard. Canada hinted at something unthinkable, pulling the plug. Cutting off the flow. Quietly, the words, oil weapon, started moving through Washington like a draft in a locked room. What if your next fill-up cost twice as much and no one explained why? What if a decision made hundreds of miles away rewrote the cost of gas, groceries, electricity, everything? This wasn't a stunt. It wasn't even public. But it pushed the US to the brink of an energy crisis without a single barrel being touched. And when Canada hinted it could flip the switch, America quietly backed off, because it knew exactly what would happen if the tap really closed. Most people never hear stories like this. That's not an accident. Some videos give you trivia. This one, it gives you an edge. It started the same way every trade war does: threats, retaliation, dramatic headlines. But this time, something different was brewing under the surface. When Donald Trump returned to office in January 2025, he brought the old playbook: emergency orders, sweeping tariffs, a display of strength. Among those was a 25% tariff on Canadian imports. But energy? That got a gentler touch. Just 10%. Why? Because the US can't survive without Canadian oil. That's the truth. And the people who actually run things know it. Canadian oil makes up 60% of all US oil imports, more than OPEC, more than Mexico. Refineries across the Midwest aren't just built to handle oil, they're built to handle this oil. It's thick, heavy, chemically distinct. You can't just swap it for Texas crude or turn a valve and hope it works. The machines won't run. The chemistry doesn't lie. At first, Canada played by the rules. Standard retaliation, agriculture, metals. But by March, the language shifted. A Canadian official dropped a sentence like a pin in a glass room: of course there's oil and gas. We kept that in our cards. Markets heard it for what it was. Not negotiation. Escalation. Subtle. Surgical. Devastating. The threat was hypothetical, but the effect was real. Canadian crude prices surged. US refineries scrambled to hoard supply. And phone lines lit up in Washington. There are few things that truly scare a sitting president. A full-scale oil supply shock in an election year. That's top of the list. If you're still here, it's because you sense what most people miss. Power doesn't vanish. It shifts. And when you know where it's moving, you don't just keep up, you stay ahead. A few days later, Canada's Energy Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, spoke at Sarawak, the Davos of energy. His words were calm, careful, almost polite. We're not looking for escalation. But we have options. That was all he said. He didn't need to say more. The strongest move is the one you don't make, just make them believe you might. For decades, the U.S. Canada energy relationship was untouchable. Sacred, even. No Canadian government had ever considered turning oil into a weapon. That line was never even approached, until now. And the moment Canada stepped near it, the system reacted like it had touched a live wire. Markets didn't wait for confirmation. The price gap between Canadian heavy crude and West Texas Intermediate collapsed. Usually, that spread sits comfortably at $15. By March, it hit single digits. That hadn't happened without a crisis since 2018. US refiners started hoarding Canadian oil like it was gold. Not because anything had stopped, but because something might. And when energy gets political, supply chains don't argue, they just move. Behind the scenes, panic was spreading. Urgent memos from the American Petroleum Institute. CEOs whispering into back channels. They knew what few others did: the US couldn't afford to lose that oil. Strategic reserves. Sure, they sound impressive, 350 million barrels. But that's less than 3 months of partial coverage. You can't frack your way out of that hole overnight. You can't buy American when the pipelines only flow one direction, north to south. Refineries in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they're all designed for one thing: Canadian heavy crude. This is what 30 years of economic entanglement looks like. No backup tanks. No alternate source. Just pipes, and the assumption they'll always be full. You won't see this in headlines. You'll only catch it in the shadows, where the real decisions get made before the rest of the world catches up. And this wasn't just about infrastructure. It was math. If Canada had closed the taps, even slightly, gas prices in the US would have jumped 30 to 50% in weeks. Not a guess. Internal briefings from Trump's own team said exactly that. So while the president roared in public, his aides quietly eased the pressure. Not to be friendly. To survive. Because they knew, Canada wasn't bluffing anymore. But something else was happening. Canada started to crack from within. The oil weapon wasn't just controversial globally, it was radioactive at home. Alberta, the province that produces over 80% of Canadian oil, wasn't playing Ottawa's game. Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith didn't mince words. She called the idea of cutting oil exports unacceptable, not because she supported Trump, far from it, but because her province's economy would collapse without US buyers. 97% of Canadian oil exports go to America. There is no plan B, no Asian buyers lined up. No alternate pipeline to the Pacific. Just a vast, continent-spanning system that only works in one direction. If the US stopped buying, Alberta wouldn't slow down. It would implode. Canada doesn't have enough refining capacity. It doesn't have ships waiting in port. It would take years to reroute flow. The money, and the oil, runs south. So when Ottawa floated the threat of shutting the taps, Alberta saw it for what it was: a dangerous bluff. Like threatening to blow up your own house just to scare your neighbor. Economists had a name for it: mutual economic hostage-taking. The US couldn't lose Canadian oil without a domestic meltdown. Canada couldn't survive without the US as a customer. Both had power. Neither could win. It was economic mutually assured destruction, missiles replaced by barrels. Then, another twist. Mid-March, the political landscape cracked. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was out. Replaced by Mark Carney, a global finance titan, not a career politician. His tone was cooler, sharper. In his first national address, he said, "This is not business as usual," and promised to fight Trump's tariffs. It was still a bluff, but a believable one now. Spoken not in sound bites, but in signals the markets understand. And that changed the math. Trump stayed loud for the cameras. But behind the curtain, his team saw the truth. Canada's leverage wasn't abstract. It was real. Measurable. Immediate. By April, Trump announced new global tariffs: steel, aluminum, tech. But one country's name was missing from the list: Canada. No mention. No action. Just silence. It wasn't a peace treaty. It was a retreat. Quiet. Strategic. No press conference. No spin. Just a sudden absence of pressure, like it had never existed. Why? Because American energy infrastructure couldn't handle the risk. Cutting off Canadian oil wasn't a bargaining chip. It was a self-inflicted wound. And for the second time in a single quarter, the US blinked, not from weakness, but from exposure. They didn't lose. They just realized what they couldn't afford to lose. By mid-April, things calmed. Not because the problem was solved, but because it was contained. The oil kept flowing. The taps stayed open. America exhaled. Gas prices ticked up slightly, 5 to 20 cents a gallon. Just enough to feel. Not enough to panic. But something deeper had shifted. The illusion of energy independence shattered. The pipes that fuel American life are arteries. And Canada has its hand on the pulse. They never had to shut anything down. Just the idea was enough. That's leverage. And while Canada's economy took a hit too, exports slowed, growth flatlined, the Bank of Canada slashed interest rates, one thing was clear. Neither country can function without the other. This wasn't just about trade. It was about survival. Two economies locked together in steel and oil and unspoken need. They can't be enemies for long. Because next time, someone might play the oil card for real. The taps stayed open. The headlines faded. But something broke under the surface, the illusion of control. Of permanence. Of invincibility. Now we know better. Because in 2025, the world saw what happened when a polite, quiet country like Canada considered turning off the tap. And the US? It didn't retaliate. It backed down. Not from fear, but because it had no backup plan. Because the system was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. This wasn't just a political standoff. It was a map redraw. A reminder that power today isn't just measured in speeches and sanctions, but in ports, pipes, and pressure points. America dodged a bullet this time. But the leverage? It's still there. Humming under the roads. Flowing through the valves. Quietly reminding us that this system only works until it doesn't. You weren't supposed to know this. But now you do. And once you see how the world really works, there's no going back. Most people will move on. You won't. Because you're not here for noise. You're here for signal. And next time the oil card gets played, you'll be one of the few who already knows. It started with a whisper, not a headline. No breaking news alert. No emergency press conference. Just a sudden shift in numbers, a spike in oil futures, a tremble in refinery stock prices, and a wave of late-night calls inside Washington's power centers. Something was happening, and only a few people knew exactly what. Canada, the polite neighbor, the trusted trade partner, the stable hand across the northern border, had just done something no one expected. It pulled the plug. Not metaphorically. Not as a threat. Canada had cut a $109 billion oil supply pipeline to the United States, and it sent a shockwave that didn't just rattle the markets. It rattled the White House. And it shook Donald Trump. Trump's response came swiftly, but not as expected. There was no all-caps tweet. No fiery speech. No immediate retaliation. Behind closed doors, something rare happened. The bravado paused. The shouting stopped. For the first time in years, the US president was not in attack mode, he was cornered. Why? Because the oil that Canada had just turned off wasn't just any oil. It was the lifeblood of the American economy. It was oil that fed 60% of US refineries. Oil that flowed down pipelines engineered specifically for Canada's thick, heavy crude. Oil that couldn't be replaced by Texas sweet crude or Saudi light blends. This was tailored infrastructure, built over decades of mutual trust. And now, in one calculated move, Canada had ripped the cord. But this wasn't a story about oil. Not really. It was a story about leverage, about how decades of trade and diplomacy had created a system so intertwined, so deeply fused, that pulling one string risked unraveling the entire fabric. Trump's team knew it. His advisors knew it. And when the Canadian energy minister made the announcement in front of a hushed room of oil executives in Calgary, every refinery CEO in the United States understood what came next: crisis. Back in Washington, the panic was immediate but silent. Trump's economic team went into emergency sessions. The Department of Energy scrambled to reassess the state of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Reports were rushed to the Oval Office. If the flow from Canada remained shut off, U.S. gasoline prices could spike by 40% within 6 weeks. That wasn't a guess. It was math. And for an administration entering another election cycle, that kind of economic blow wasn't just bad optics, it was political suicide. The public didn't know it yet. They were still filling up their tanks at the local gas station, unaware that the supply chain behind their fuel was now fractured. But insiders did. Oil traders began hoarding barrels. Futures contracts swung wildly. And the phrase that started echoing through high-level meetings on both sides of the border was simple, chilling, and completely new. Economic mutually assured destruction. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Trump had re-entered office with a strategy. Dominate trade talks, reassert America's strength, slap tariffs on imports, and bend allies to Washington's will. Canada was supposed to play along. But when the US slapped a new 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum, then hinted at extending it to energy, Canada didn't flinch. It retaliated. And then, it escalated. Quietly, behind a diplomatic smile, it did the unthinkable. It closed the tap. $109 billion worth of oil, a flow that had become routine, invisible, automatic, was gone.